to get my gavel for Julia. Okay, everyone ready? You're ready? I'm gonna gavel us in. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kim Janey, and in addition to being president of the Boston City Council, I'm also chair of the Committee on Rules and Administration. Today is Friday, November 13th, 2020. We are here today for a virtual hearing on docket number 0425 in order for a hearing on public hearings as they relate to government accountability and accessibility. This hearing order is sponsored by Councilors Julia Mejia and Lydia Edwards. It was referred to the committee on February 26, 2020. In accordance with Governor Baker's March 12, 2020 executive order, modifying certain requirements of the open meeting law and relieving public bodies of certain requirements, including the requirement that public bodies conduct its meetings in a public place that is open and physically accessible to the public, the City Council will be conducting this hearing virtually via Zoom. This enables the City Council to carry out its responsibilities while adhering to public health accommodations and ensuring public access to its deliberations through adequate alternative means. The public may watch this meeting via live stream at www.boston.gov/city-council-TV. It will also be rebroadcasted at a later date on Infinity 8 and RCN 82 and Verizon 964. For public testimony, written comments may be sent to the committee email at ccc.ra@boston.gov. Let me do that again, ccc.ra@boston.gov, and will be made part of the record and available to all counselors. We will take verbal public testimony throughout this hearing. We will have a number of people, I think we have a number of people signed up. If you have not requested the Zoom link to have your name added to the testimony list, we encourage you to do so now by emailing christine.o'donnell@boston.gov. Again, that's christine.o'donnell@boston.gov. There is simultaneous interpretation available in Spanish during this public hearing. At the bottom of the screen, you will see a globe button. You can click on the globe button and select a channel in the language that you would like to listen. You can also turn off the English channel if you don't want to hear the original audio in the background. And I want to, at this time, ask our interpreter for Spanish language to introduce herself and to repeat these instructions. I believe it's Gabriela. Gabriela, I want to invite you to the mic to say these instructions in Spanish, please.
Buenas tardes, ¿me escuchan?
Sí.
Gracias. Bienvenidos a esta reunión virtual para hablar de la orden del día 425 en accesibilidad. Mi nombre es Gabriela Herrera, yo soy su intérprete del día y queremos que sepan que en la parte de abajo de su pantalla va a haber un icono para interpretación. Tienen que escoger español para escuchar esta reunión en español y también si están conectados desde su teléfono, por favor opriman estrella, primero opriman more si está en inglés o más y 3 puntitos y después de ahí van a ver español, escogen español y después finalizar. Y con eso van a poder seguir esta reunión en español. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much. And before we kind of dive in, I want to take care of just another item in terms of housekeeping. There is a letter from one of our colleagues. I'm going to read this into the public record. This is from Councilor Andrea Campbell, and she writes on November 12th, 2020, she writes, "Dear Chairwoman Janey and colleagues of the Rules and Administration Committee, I regretfully cannot attend today's hearing on docket number 0425 in order for a hearing on public hearings as they relate to government accountability and accessibility. Please extend my thanks to the sponsors, Councilor Edwards and Mejia, for calling for such a timely and important conversation. In our response to the pandemic, we've been thrust into a virtual world that has shown some of the ways that technology can help make our government more accessible, and there's much more work to be done to ensure all Bostonians have access to our government. I will be ably represented by a member of my staff at today's hearing, and I look forward to reviewing today's hearing recording and committee report and working with the committee on any recommended next steps. Sincerely, Andrea Campbell, Boston City Councilor, District 4. And at this time, I would just like to offer a few words before I turn it over to the makers of this hearing order, and then open it up for openings of my colleagues in order of arrival. And then we'll also introduce the panel, and then go right into hearing any opening from the panel, and then some Q&A. I ask that folks bear with me. This is the first time I'm chairing a hearing since December of 2019. So I'm gonna just start by thanking again my sisters in service, Councilor Edwards and Councilor Mejia, for this very important, very timely hearing order to make our work more accessible. I think there is a general desire across the board of my colleagues and this body as a whole, really wanting to make sure that we are engaging the public, and that the public can not only hold us accountable, but really be part of this work, and how we do that in terms of our hours, in terms of language access, in terms of having hearings on-site and off-site. All of those things are important. So I just want to thank Councilor Mejia and Councilor Edwards for their constant advocacy on this issue, and to the many advocates who also care deeply about accountability, transparency, and accessibility. I am thankful for our amazing central staff who make us look good every single day, who do the incredibly hard work, like organizing our hearings, especially when they're off-site and off hours. It is a big lift. We are always happy to do it as counselors, and I know our central staff are happy to do it as well, but it is a heavy lift. And I want to thank them for not just keeping the trains running, if you will, when we are doing these hearings and meetings virtually, but when we were able to do them in person, and particularly when we were doing them off-site, all of the amazing work of central staff. As president of the most diversity council in Boston's history, it is very important that we ensure that our work is much more accessible, transparent, and engaging for folks. When I first joined this body, my maiden speech was on small business, supporting small business owners, economic development, economic justice. And we had that first hearing in the district. I am very proud of the work that we've been able to do in that space, and working with all of my colleagues and making sure that our work is more accessible. I'm going to now, at this time, turn it over to my colleagues, the sponsors of this hearing order. I will have some other remarks as I dive into questions, so I will save other remarks for that time. And I want to, at this time, invite the makers of this hearing order to offer opening statements. And I will begin with Councilor Mejia. Councilor Mejia, you now have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. And thanks to my co-sponsor, Councilor Edwards, for partnering with our office on this initiative. Before we got into office, people would always ask me what was going to be my first hearing. And I'm like, I'm going to do a hearing on public hearings, just because a lot of the things that Council President mentioned in terms of accessibility and the importance of really creating space for those who are living the realities to inform and be a part of those hearings, and removing the barriers to that engagement. So a lot has happened since we filed this. You know, the initial was this was going to be my first hearing, but then COVID happened, and well, hello, we had a lot of other things that we needed to focus on. But what we have learned is that COVID has created an opportunity for us to really be innovative and to think outside the box in terms of that level of engagement. And so I would love to first, before I dive into additional remarks, just wanted to also echo our gratitude to Central staff for the amazing transition from being in the chamber to going to Zoom and creating space for people to be connected. And what we have seen as a result of that level of engagement is the number of people who have tuned into our public hearings, who are now via Zoom, sharing their testimonies through videos. It's just, I could see that just that access to technology has removed a lot of barriers for folks. So that is definitely a step in the right direction, and so incredibly grateful to Central staff for all their hard work in helping us go virtual. It has been a transition and one that we continue to learn from. So really looking forward to what comes of that as we return, if we ever do, to normal, because nobody knows, you know, when that's gonna happen, if at all. And if it does, it's not normal that we want anyways. But in addition to what this hearing is about, having participated in countless hearings in my time on the council, what I have noticed is even the structure of how our hearings are conducted and who has an opportunity to speak at what point. And when I think about a public hearing, I think about public voice and really creating space for the public to lead and to inform our thinking. And so even structurally, there's lots of things that I've learned since the filing that I think I'm hoping that we can unpack in this hearing order to really amplify the importance of leading with voice and creating space for those who are living the realities and doing the work to really have a place to speak, so that we're not hearing from the administration and our colleagues. And even though I know that's how things are normally done, doesn't necessarily mean that we can't change how things are done so that we can create space for folks to really feel heard. And here's just some context. In 2019, the Boston City Council held 148 public hearings, and only 3 took place outside of City Hall. And a big shout out to those district councilors that did that, named President Council Janey for doing her due diligence and making sure that that happens. And I know that other district councilors have done hearings in their districts. And I think that that's a good practice. And I understand the hardships that it causes on the entire staff. And even our district colleagues, when we do things after hours, that it's a lot to ask, but I do know that those pushes definitely do make an impact in terms of who shows up. Obviously, with the impact of COVID, we've moved our hearings online, but there's still communities who we're leaving out in the process. And there's ways that we can make these meetings more representative of the communities that we're here to serve. Making our hearings more representative of the people is a low bar, but it's often one that we find ourselves tripping over after time and time again. We are the representatives of the people, and it is our job and our obligation to put systems in place to help us meet people where they're at, literally. And I think one of the things too that I have learned, aside from just public hearings, are community meetings through the BPDA, hearings for boards and commissions. Like, I think that this hearing order, while it was initially intended just around public hearings, but I'm hoping that we utilize and seize this moment to really think about all the spaces where public voices need to be heard, and that we build the infrastructure to ensure that level of engagement exists across all areas of city government. So thank you so much for those who are here to participate in our public hearing, and I'm looking forward to a robust conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilor Mejia. Councilor Edwards, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'll be brief because I know one of the things Councilor Mejia and I discussed is that in many times where we have a public hearing, councilors and those who are industry experts tend to take up all the space. And so we want to make sure that this is a time for us to be critical of ourselves, hold ourselves accountable for the space that we claim to be creating for the public. Is it as multilingual as it should be? Is it at a level, and I again thank Councilor Mejia so many times for breaking me down to break it down, that is truly accessible? Because if the people who are going to be most impacted by the policies, ideas, and conversations that we are having don't understand them or don't feel that their expertise is valued, then we are failing them. So today's hearing is about how we listen to our communities. I'm so excited to listen today. I'm excited to better how I listen to others tomorrow. And again, I want to echo the thanks to central staff. Every time I have said we got to go to the community, there has never been a no, never been a complaint. It has been a where you need us at, counselor. We'll be there more than prepared, microphones ready. And I, again, want to thank them so much for everything that they have done.
Thank you so much, Councillor Edwards. In order of arrival for brief openings, I will call upon Councillor Flynn, followed by Councillor Braden. And then I think Councillor Bach is in the mix as well. So Councillor Flynn, you have the floor.
Thank you, Council President Janey. Thank you to Councillor Mejia, Councillor Edwards for sponsoring this important hearing. It's important that we provide more opportunities for access and to engage residents who traditionally are unable to participate in our public hearings. I frequently talk about my district, where I have a large Cantonese speaking population and a large Spanish speaking population. I thank the sponsors and Councilor Janey for bringing these issues forward, because it's these types of hearings and listening and talking to residents that we can improve basic city services and making sure that every resident has access to city government, to city services. I know Councilor Janey and Councilor Edwards and Mejia also mentioned central staff. They do an outstanding job bringing this message to residents. I also want to highlight my own staff. I have 4 women of color that work for me, and they all speak various languages, and they're all immigrants. And they bring an entirely different perspective of the job to me, and with different advice and recommendations, but they can communicate with my constituents that I could not be able to communicate with because of their language, speaking more than one language. I would be only collecting a paycheck if I didn't have a dedicated staff that could communicate and work on my behalf for the residents. So I want to highlight central staff. I want to highlight my staff, but also my colleagues for their tremendous work on this important issue. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. Councillor Braden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also want to thank the makers, Councillor Mejia and Councillor Edwards, for bringing this important issue forward. Engaging with our residents across our districts is really vitally important. So often our residents feel that they don't have a voice, and I hope that we can find ways in our discussions this afternoon to raise up that voice and make it easier and more accessible for people to participate in this process. I also want to thank central staff. They're the unsung heroes in this situation. They're always working behind the scenes, and we couldn't do what we do without them. So thank you very much to the central staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Braden. I want to acknowledge that we've been joined by Councillor Asabi George, who will follow Councillor Bach. Councillor Bach, brief opening.
Thank you, Madam President. I also want to thank the makers, thanks central staff. I'll try to Councillor Edwards' point to be brief. I think it's so important for this council to model what we think public engagement should really look like. And I do think, to Councillor Mejia's point, that we often, as councillors, we're frustrated when other public agencies don't hold their public meetings in a sufficiently accessible fashion. And I think we've really got to lead by example there, whether that's language access, timing, food, childcare, where we're holding these meetings. I've been very encouraged by the number of people who I think have been able to participate in virtual things who weren't historically participating, but I've also noticed the folks who I'm missing because they're not digital, and there are parts of my district where I feel like I'm not getting those folks in these digital rooms. And so I think, we have to take that 360 view and really I hope one of the things that'll come out of this hearing is bringing a bunch of the lessons of sort of community organizing and what meetings look like in all of our communities, to the council. Obviously, public hearings have to reach a certain standard of kind of universal accessibility, and you're doing them for a much wider array of people than you often are at a given community organization. But I know I'm not alone as a counselor in having had a life before this that consisted of a lot of creative, well, how do we think about how to get more of our community here? And I think it's important to recognize that, big G government is still community at the end of the day, and we're trying to bring more voices in. So how do we bring those community organizing lessons to bear here? Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thanks again to the makers.
Thank you so much, Councillor Bach. Councillor Sabi George.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the makers for today's hearing. As I tuned in just a few minutes late, I want to echo all of my colleagues' sentiments and comments and leave it at that. Look forward to the rest of the hearing. Thank you.
Great. At this time, then, I am going to ask for our esteemed panel to introduce themselves. I'll call upon you. You can give a brief opening. I'm just going to list all of you, and in the order that I list you in, if you could just open up and go from there. Okay, sound good? So for this first panel, we have Julady Valdez, who is our staff director for central staff. And many of the thanks that people were offering in their opening comments, we should direct some of those directly to Julady, who oversees all of the staff there. We have Ruby Reyes, who is the director of Beja, who is a frequent panelist and public testifier at our hearings, and we're really grateful for your constant engagement and leadership in the education space, but obviously in ways as an organizer to make sure that we are much more accountable and transparent in our work. And then we also have on our first panel, Stephanie Almazar, who is a parent organizer at St. Stephen's Youth Programs. And please let me know if I have mispronounced your name. I certainly apologize. And I don't see that person in this Zoom, or at least on my box. So if that person is with us, just raise your hand so I can know that you're here, please. Okay, maybe they're not. Oh, I do see a Stephanie just popped in. So we're gonna go in that order, starting with Ms. Valdez. Ms. Valdez?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate all your words. My name is Julady Valdez. I'm the Central Staff Director, and I look forward to just listening, learning, and seeing how we can provide the best service and continue to grow and move the council forward when it comes to access. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ms. Reyes?
Thank you. So my name is Ruby Reyes. I'm the director of the Boston Education Justice Alliance, and we're a small grassroots organization that does advocacy with parents, students, and teachers from the Boston Public Schools. And a lot of our meetings are, there's translation available, and we've kind of gone through the motions of learning and growing in the new virtual world. So I'm just gonna share a few of those tips and just, we also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the moments and times that we have also advocated for the Boston Public Schools to provide testimony, to provide interpretation, and make school committee meetings more accessible to families, which we have continued to push from before COVID and virtual worlds, and we'll continue to push now as well. So thank you for having us.
Madam President.
Ms. Stephanie? And am I pronouncing your name correctly? Please correct me.
Yeah, it's correct, Stephanie.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Please.
Good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Almanza. I'm parent coordinator from St. Stephen, and I'm here also to give, to say what we're organizing with the parents and what, all the activity we have, and a way we include the translation, because some parents just speak Spanish, and all the testimony that we also gave to Boston Public School. That's all.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to, at this time, turn it over to the makers for any questions that they may have of this panel. Certainly, I think the idea here is to get whatever ideas and recommendations that we can implement. I am certainly very interested in your comments, Ms. Reyes, around like the school committee, which I feel like they offer language interpretation more frequently, at least than we do. So I understand that there are some challenges there, and I just wonder like how their budget works, how we can replicate. Obviously, they're not the model. I want to agree there that I think across the board, public bodies have some work to do. But at this time, let me turn it over to our makers for any questions. Again, we are hoping for a solution-oriented conversation here, and I'm going to turn it over to Councilor Mejia. Councilor Mejia?
Yes, thank you. Yes, in the whole spirit of being solution focused, this is really an opportunity for us to really figure out not so much what's not working, because we already know what's not working because we've already experienced it. And so walking away with some really specific marching orders in terms of the how we can implement and remove those barriers to engagement. And I think, Ruby, to your point in regards to the school committee, I wholeheartly agree. I think those presentations and everything that gets done, and then at 11 o'clock at night, we open it up for public testimony. And then parents who have been waiting for hours and hours and hours to speak, you know, can't do so because now their kids are in bed. And so we just have to figure out that whole structure. And while this is public hearings, I do see the school committee and other boards and commissions and public spaces that the Boston City is responsible for, that we need to revise all of those spaces. But I'm gonna start with some of my questions for Ms. Valdez. Can you talk to us a little bit about how central staff manage the switch from in-person to Zoom hearings? Do we have any plans to continue with Zoom hearings once in person? And can you also walk us through how interpretation services are requested? How do people who need languages other than English communicate that to central staff? And can you talk about some of the logistics that go into coordinating hearings offsite? So help us understand what that looks like.
You're still on mute? Yeah.
The transition to virtual was a little bit challenging because we didn't really know what we were doing. We hit the ground running and we took off from there. We had to relearn a lot of things and try to keep it the same as if we were in the chamber, but virtually. And little by little, we you know, me and my team will get together, figure out what was working, what was not working, find solutions. Very involved with the council president as well, who directed us, you know, throughout this whole process. And that's how we are here today with a successful operation, never got Zoom bombed. And that's how the transition was handled.
You have to be careful what you wish for. You say never got Zoom bombed. Be careful.
This is true. This is true. We hope to continue that streak, and that will never happen. Prior to COVID, offsite hearings were pretty much based on what the topic was and who do you want there, what communities you are trying to get to. So for example, Councilor Campbell hosted a hearing at the Suffolk Correctional Facility because it was something that had to do with them. You know what I mean? Sometimes if it's something that it's for, let's say, a school, the council will try to bring it to the community there. It's very important to be I wouldn't say, well, strategic, because we have to figure out how to reach those constituents and at the same time not exclude everyone else. So that is the challenge with working offsites, and why they're very specific.
Are we thinking? I was gonna say, are we thinking of continuing Zoom hearings once in person resumes? Are you guys considering keeping
Well,
this as an option?
That's not up to us. It will depend on the governor's order, the executive order, and what is implemented moving forward. So we will adjust. Our hopes is that we can keep many of these good features when we're back in person, in a way that works. So that's the hope.
And sorry to interject, but as President Julia, that would also be under my purview. And so happy to hear comments and recommendations from colleagues. But as long as the governor's order is in effect, we will continue virtual. I think that there are some benefits to, not to make light of our pandemic, but there have been some things that we've learned to do differently that we may want to hold on to, like how we engage people using technology if they can't be there in person when we do go back to person. But as long as the governor's orders is in place, we are going to continue to operate, keeping the health of the public at the forefront of our mind, as well as the health of our staff and our team members.
Thank you for that. I think that there is definitely an opportunity to bring the best practices in person and find a hybrid to figure out the level of engagement. Thank you for that clarity. I'm gonna go on to Ruby.
I was gonna say about interpreters. I didn't tell you about the interpreters.
Oh yeah. No.
We handle those on a request basis. So if a constituent requests interpreter services for a particular hearing, we try to manage that. And also, if a need is determined, although no one has requested it, we know there's a need for it, usually the chair or the sponsor will reach out for interpretation services. So we handle it on a request basis.
Thank you for that. And Madam Chair, if we have round two, I'll come back to Ms. Valdez with some additional follow-ups, but I want to just make sure that I'm mindful of time. I just want to ask Ruby, before COVID, could you talk a little bit about how you hosted meetings? What were some of the services that you provided? How did parents reach out to request them? Because I know you guys do a lot of great work in terms of that level of engagement and bringing people into the space. So can you share with us some of the best practices that your organization has done to bring parents in?
Sure. So BEJA is an alliance. So we bring together groups of different organizations to work and mobilize around particular issues, recognizing the fact that parents and families have particular issues that they're dealing with at their school level. So we reach out to different groups. We work in partnership with the staff or organizers at that particular parents group. We also recognize the fact that we have a lot of engagement with St. Stephen's families, which is wonderful. But we do our every 6 month kind of assessment of where we're at. And we recognize the fact that we had no Asian families whatsoever. So we began reaching out to different organizations like the Federation for Children with Special Needs that work with Asian families specifically in different ways. And so really thinking about how our communities are made up and where we have gaps. And so we identified gaps, and then we reached out to those groups in order to be able to bring their voices to the table. I will say that before COVID, we would have different community meetings. We would do 3 months in a neighborhood. So that way we would use a space and we would have our workshops and stuff there. So it was more accessible to families so that they lived up the street. And so we would rotate every 3 months. We'd be in a different different Boston neighborhood. And with that, we would always provide childcare, translation, and food. I think those are vital pieces to making it accessible to families, having events and things on the weekends, in the evenings or the early evenings. I think timing is also important. And now, like as we're in COVID, we try to always have translation in Spanish at very minimum. And now figuring out kind of, we've also kind of like learned the Zoom, we were Zoom bombed. So we've learned kind of, you know, from our mistakes and things. So we also, there's different ways that you can do things that are cheaper. So we're not a large organization. We have a very small budget, but we prioritize interpretation as an expense. We also pay our interpreters. Gabriela is actually often our interpreter. We pay our interpreters, comparable rates. And we've talked about the Boston Public School doesn't do that. And so the quality and level of interpretation is very different for the Boston Public Schools, in part because, we've had BPS interpreters before where I've asked them to just leave because they're not doing a good job. I think the way that you have medical interpreters, the way you have legal interpreters, you also have to have interpreters that are on the education front, like knowing the terminology and things of that nature. And you have to pay them a professional rate, which I think, that requires you to make those accommodations in your budget and prioritize those things. But also, I don't see that in the Boston Public Schools. So yeah.
Yeah, so I want to do a quick follow-up and then I'm going to go to Stephanie. I'm just curious, Ruby, and I know that you participate in a lot of hearings and so do the members of your organization and just the groups that you work with. I'm just curious if you could provide some really honest feedback on some of the things that you think that we should be doing or we could be doing better to ensure that people feel heard.
I think, for us, we reach out to folks. So if I know that there's a hearing yesterday there was a hearing on like BPS facilities. So there was a couple folks that I reached out to that I was like, hey, this is going on. Make sure that if you want to, give your testimony, I also sometimes support them. I say the things that you said at this meeting were really great. These are the points, that maybe you could just at least make those 2 points. We also provide as much support as we can in terms of if parents need support in writing their testimony, which I think St. Stephen's does amazingly well. So we really, I feel like reaching out to the folks that are really active on particular topics. If there's a housing hearing, who your housing groups are, reach out to them, be like, by the way, we need you here. We need this voice here, which I think this council has done incredibly well in comparison to, I think, the previous council of just kind of alerting folks that different things are going on. I've been asked to be on panels more, I think, this past year than the year before, which I think, Beja is a very, our opinions and our work is very much centered on equity and serving those who often are voiceless. So I think, really just making sure that those voices that are often different or not heard as often are specifically reached out to and supported to give testimony.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Councilor Mejia, before you go on, I just, I hope that you are coming to a conclusion. I'm just mindful that other colleagues are here. I did not set a timer. So I just want to manage the time, and I'm not sure how many people in the public are waiting to testify, and I'd like to weave them in throughout and not make them wait to the end. So if you could perhaps, and I will make sure we get a second round for you, but if you could maybe.
Yep. No, that's why I was like,
okay.
The timing situation is important. I can ask Stephanie. My last question is just really about cómo ustedes acomodan los horarios de los padres. porque todo el mundo tiene diferentes necesidades. So, ¿cómo ustedes acomodan la necesidad de los padres? I asked her how do they accommodate demanding parent schedules.
Es una buena pregunta. Primeramente fue difícil, como tú dices, padres estaban trabajando al principio y fue un challenge, como yo digo. Lo primero que nosotros hicimos fue hacer un surprise para ellos, viendo la comodidad primero de ellos. Entonces, dependiendo de la contestación de que ellos nos estaban dando, entonces ahí fue que nosotros pudimos hacer un schedule tanto para los padres y como para nosotras para poder llevar a cabo todas las actividades que tenemos.
That's a great idea, surveying parents to identify what are the best times for meetings and hearings. I think is a great, something for us to consider, surveying the community before we start putting notices out, just to see what the people's availability is. Thank you for that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. At this time, I'm going to call upon Councillor Edwards. Councillor Edwards.
Thank you so much. And I just want to echo, one, I've had a wonderful conversation with Ruby. And I really do appreciate, she does put the work in what she has been able to do and bring people to the table and also educate. She educated me greatly. So I wanted to thank you for that. I have not had the same amount of communication with Stephanie, but I can hear in your voice, your passion and your dedication. And so thank you. And I look forward to learning from you. You lady, my girl, I just have to say thank you for everything, all the work, all the effort, even now, as council was down for a little bit, but you were there. So I just thank you so much. And I got a little swollen eyes from, so I'm not on camera for a reason. That's all. Anyway, I just thank you guys so much. So today is the day that I'm going to learn the most from about being a better counselor. And so I'll ask 2 or 3 questions for all of you to answer at your convenience. Number 1, do you or your constituents and people that you represent, do they feel comfortable around us? Do they feel heard and valued by us, especially when coming to a hearing? Do you feel that they feel nervous? Do they feel really cared about us? I'm concerned about that. Number 2, when we say you can follow up with the email or something else, is that actually believed? Do people believe that writing to us actually gets to us? I'm really concerned about that. Finally, when they are on the same panel as an English speaker or a lawyer or with the police, do they really believe that they are seen on par and equal to them? Those are my questions. So do they feel cared about us? Do they feel when they follow up to us that we actually get the communication? And when they are part of a panel or communication that involves the police or administration, so it's not so much the police, the experts, if you will, do they feel that they are seen equal in our eyes? Concerned about those things. That's all, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Councillor Edwards. Does anyone on this panel want to take any of those questions? Just unmute yourself. Yep. Go ahead, Ms. Reyes.
Well, I can share, yesterday's panel around the facilities and safety, I think was, the testimony was a follow-up to the hearing, I think on Tuesday around the information sharing and surveillance ordinances. And I think a lot of the folks felt like, the Boston Public School officials that were invited did not show up. And I know that that was particularly disheartening, around these issues. So, and I know that you all work very hard to find panelists, and it is hard to schedule them. But to me, that really, it really struck a chord, just because I know how hard folks have been organizing around that particular issue. And so I think the lack of feeling heard wasn't necessarily from counselors, it was more from the selection of panelists and the influence in getting them to the table to these folks that, are equal to them, or I think to, police officers or whatever. So I think really making the efforts to get those folks there, getting them to stay. Those are the folks that really need to hear the things that we're saying, and they're often the first to jump off. So maybe switching the order of the panels, if you're going to have like community folks, having them go first, and then, BPS officials, because often, we say these things at BPS school committee meetings. We have to say them over and over and over and just really badger what feels like badgering in order for something to happen. And so I will say that with this council, I think there is more of a wonderful opportunity to have diverse voices at the table and bring up different issues. So I think, folks are way more approachable, I find. I met with a couple of counselors before kind of this slate, and just didn't have the best experience. And so I do appreciate the group of folks that are kind of working together. I do think you all should also talk more across each other's offices, because all these issues are so entwined, regardless of whether it is, like education, how that creeps into, these surveillance ordinances. I think all these issues are so entwined for families and residents that, I know you all have different committees that you're responsible for, or topics, but really being able to have policy understanding of these different issues, I think it brings more wealth to the table. And then I will say that it is nerve-wracking. I get very nervous in terms of public speaking. And it's something that I've had to, I have to do it so often, but it is very nerve-wracking for families that are doing it for the first time. And I've seen you all be very encouraging to folks. So I appreciate that a great deal. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Stephanie, did you want to add to that? Did you want to answer any of those questions from Councillor Edwards?
Yeah, I was almost the same that Ruby was saying. When we go to give testimony for BPS, some parents don't speak English. They don't feel like welcome. When they get there, it's no interpretation. When the meeting starts, just when they give you the testimony, they have someone, to translate that they is saying back. And in the meeting, it take like 1 hour. They on Zoom that hour, they understand anything that they're saying, because they need conversation for the whole meeting, not only when they're gonna talk. So I have a lot of parent concern about that. They want, to be there. In other hearings, they want to be there, but they don't feel welcome because they don't have interpretation when they need to.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Councillor Edwards, were you good with your questions? Did you need any follow-up before I go on to colleagues? Okay.
Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I really, let me just say before I turn it over to colleagues in order of appearance, and to remind folks, it's Flynn, Braden, Bach, and Asabi George. I really appreciate what you both have said, Ruby and Stephanie, on this particular point. I think, 2 years ago to this day, I held a hearing in my district in the bowling building. In fact, Councillor Edwards chaired it as the housing chair. It was packed. It was one of those important issues you need to kind of do in the district. And so we need to make sure that there are more opportunities, not just for the offsite, but how we structure the hearing. I remember having a conversation with the administration and getting lots of pushback. So for me, I was very clear. I didn't want to start our hearing the way we always start our hearing, which is you hear from all the counselors, then you hear from the administration, and then finally you hear from the community. Like, I wanted to start one with the community. I wanted to mix up the admin panel and the community panel. They didn't want to do that. So we had to still keep everything separate. So what I did as the compromise is I wanted to set the stage. So I had an opening like I had a community panelist kind of set the stage to open up. Here we are, and then we went into the admin panel. And I think many of my colleagues have often tried to be creative. Let's start the hearing with public testimony. Let's have a hearing that's nothing but public testimony. And I think we need to do much more of that. I've only seen a couple of colleagues do that. I've seen Councilor Sabi George do that around education, and our sister in service, former city councilor and now Congresswoman Presley, I remember she did a listening session around trauma. I think we need to do much more of that. And then Stephanie, to your point, people need to understand the whole hearing, not just have us understand what the public testimony is that might be coming to us in another language. And I think that is something that we all are committed to figuring out how we can do and do it better. And obviously there are going to be some financial considerations for us that we've got to figure out how to, build that into our budget so that we can do that. I want to acknowledge before I turn it over to colleagues that we've been joined by Councilor Arroyo, who will follow Councilor Asabi George in the queue. And at this time, I am going to turn it over for questions to Councilor Flynn. Councilor Flynn, you have the floor.
Thank you, Council President Janey, and thank you to Ruby and to Stephanie. You provided excellent feedback. And on Stephanie's point on the BPS meeting there last week or several weeks ago, most of the meeting was not translated. It was only translated during the Q&A or the feedback part. And that was the most frustrating part to me as someone that represents a large non-English speaking community. Cantonese, Mandarin, and Spanish, is my constituents waited there 3 hours. And then when it was their turn to speak, then it was translated, but they were there for the mayor's and the superintendent's comments, but they didn't understand what they were saying. So, translation services are critical, but effective translation interpretation is what we want. So I want to say thank you to both Ruby and Stephanie. And I think my last point I just want to make is just using that BPS as an example. You have a lot of parents and they're putting their kids to bed at a certain time, but to have a meeting go on until 1 o'clock in the morning is not fair. It has to be broken down to two meetings if we're going to do that. But you can't have a meeting go on until 1 o'clock in the morning. I can't stay up that late. I just can't do it physically. I don't know if other people feel that way, but it's not fair to the parents. It's not fair to the people that want to give feedback for them to be at a meeting 5 hours waiting to give public comments. So maybe those comments are helpful to this topic, but I want to say thank you to my colleagues for their important work on this issue. And thank you, Ruby, and thank you to Stephanie as well.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. Councilor Braden?
Thank you, and thank you, Ruby and Stephanie and Julie. I really appreciate the information you've shared. I know from my own experience, first time standing in front of a microphone in City Hall, it's nerve-wracking, and I really applaud the folks that you can work with who bring forward those voices into this public space, and it's so important to hear those things. I also have had the experience of listening to a hearing where the public got to put, I think it was Michelle, Councillor Wu was doing a hearing on buses and better buses and whatever a few years ago. And it was like, wow, she had the public comments first. And everybody, the folks who had prepared to come and speak really appreciated that, because many of them were coming outside their comfort zone, and to put them out first and hear what they had to say and hear their issues was really important. I just know, I don't know you know, I think this conversation we're having has implications across the board in terms of all of our public meetings, not just the meetings that we host, but I think it's sort of, we need to be modeling good, trying our best to model good behavior and how to have these hearings. I know I'm getting feedback from folks who do go to development meetings, and they're finding it very unsatisfactory in this COVID virtual space, because you have a Zoom meeting and the person who's facilitating the conversation controls who's on the panel. So not everyone knows, you don't know who else is in the room with you. And members of an IAG can't even talk to each other or can't even see each other. So sometimes, you know, there's a lot of work to do in this space. I'm also all ears, Ruby, in terms of more suggestions from you anytime, anything else. I'm sure you have a long list of suggestions.
I will say that, you know, Beja, we're a small organization. We have paid for childcare for school committee meetings before, and pizza for families to be able to have their child be separate from them. So it's hard enough to give testimony, and then you have your child kind of like distracting you as well. So I do think that you know, that childcare component is really important for families. And then also really thinking about, you know, like being realistic about the communities that you're in. So if you go to East Boston, it's a large Latino population, like you have to have Spanish interpretation regardless of whether anybody registers for it, and really thinking about those things ahead of time. We have a list of different interpreters that we use so that if a person isn't available, we can call another person. Or, you know, Gabriela's amazing about connecting us with other folks too, and helping to kind of make sure that there's translation there. So I think really prioritizing it in a real way. You know, there's been so many mishaps with BPS that, you know, I think right now, currently they offer ASL interpretation, American Sign Language, for the school committee meetings, but the majority of the students in BPS are Latino. And so not to say that there aren't Spanish speaking students who use ASL, but the reality is that you should be able to, at least at the bare minimum, offer Spanish. There's been times where, you know, they've requested an interpreter and they haven't found one. So they just don't have it. So things like that, I think they're unwelcoming to families, that they have these incidences that they don't forget. So this has happened. I think this happened several months ago. I'm still hearing it from like different Chinese families from Chinatown. So just really thinking about kind of like those first impressions for our families that are doing something really courageous, and sharing their stories, and, you know, saying the things that are that are their barriers, right, to accessing quality public education. So I would just say that those are some additional things. Also, we use conference call, freeconferencecall.com. If your Zoom link doesn't work, we've had that happen before where the interpretation button doesn't work. Free conference call, you make a free account. Folks can call in for that. Our rallies, we use that as well, so that our rallies are also translated. So that way folks can have access. Our documents are translated. One of the things that I kind of yelled at one of the BPS officials about was a Google Doc that had like a registration Google Doc that was like name, telephone, neighborhood. And I'm like, why can't you use Google Translate for this? Like, I don't understand why that is such a hard thing for you to do, is to go to Google Translate and translate these very simple words into these different languages. That is what we do. You know, I do not speak Cantonese. I do not speak Haitian Creole, but we use Google Translate for basic things in order to make them also accessible in those languages.
Thank you, Ruby. And that's all I have for now. I'm sure I'll have other questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Braden. Councillor Bach?
Thank you, Madam President. I really appreciate everybody's comments, and a lot of my sort of questions and concerns have been addressed. But I guess one question I had, a thing I've thought about a lot is how often the hearings that we have, or we've got, administration members or people representing sort of decision making at any level that the council talks to. A lot of times I've noticed that, the panel itself will generate sometimes more questions than answers. And the way that I think somebody alluded to, the way that we have things set up such that often the public are going after those decision makers can make it hard to get the public's questions answered. And sometimes I think you could reverse the order and it would work, but I found myself thinking a lot about, are there ways to collect more public questions and concerns kind of more explicitly about the people want to hear answered at a hearing in advance, so that then we can really, so that the council, I think another way that the council could be better representing the public in these hearings is having more of your questions in our mouths. And so I just wonder if anybody here has thoughts about successful mechanisms for that, because I think the way that we collect testimony is very much like up to the date of the hearing and then 48 hours after, and it's useful for us to consider, but it doesn't always serve that purpose of informing the actual questions of the panel from the council. So I don't know if anybody had any thoughts about that type of thing.
I mean, we usually, Rachel, who works in Councilor Sabi George's office, is really good about emailing me the hearings with the different links, so that it's super easy and compact and right there, which I then send out. And so I think you have to solicit questions, concerns. I usually do it in our meetings where I'm like, okay, these hearings are coming up. These are opportunities for us to say these things. If folks can't make it, feel free to, incorporate different things that I'm supposed to say. And we usually collectively put together things that we want said about different things. We've also been able to go to the hearing where it's, there isn't a specific topic. You can just go and give testimony about anything without any counselors. I think the last time there was one for last year when Counselor Chiomo was still there. And so that's also a great kind of opportunity to hear things. I think having those twice a year. I know Anissa and Counselor Sabi George had one recently kind of about BPS reopening, but being able to just kind of solicit, I think maybe questions the week beforehand a hearing, I think is a good method.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I think a lot of us sort of informally do this with the folks we know to be stakeholders in a particular issue, like try to solicit those questions in advance. But yeah, I've been trying to think about how we could do that more routinely and systematically, because sometimes I think we don't use the occasions to their maximum value for the public in terms of getting information and getting their questions heard. So if anybody else didn't have any comments, I think that was the main thing on my mind right now.
Thank you so much. Councilor Sabi George.
Thank you again, Madam President. Thank you for the panelists that are here today. I think it's a really interesting, fascinating conversation, and I think it shows and demonstrates that there's no one way that we should be conducting meetings and hearings and public sessions, but that we have to be constantly trying to do better and engage the public and panelists and interested parties in very creative and thoughtful ways. And I think, for some of what we've done over time, some of it's gotten better with Zoom, some of it's gotten more difficult with Zoom, and, constantly playing, trying to figure it out and do better. But I will say on the school committee, one thing that I've noticed over the last 4 years as someone who attends almost all of those meetings, is they've moved public testimony up now. You used to have to wait until the bitter end. They've moved it,
I'm sorry to interrupt. Because of my own advocacy in that space before I became a counselor.
So they moved it up, which was really good. And now what they've done that is, I I have mixed feelings about, but it's mostly a good switch, is that they've now put public testimony immediately following the main or most major presentation of the evening. So they've even adjusted it a little bit more. And we've tried a variety of things on the council, which I think have been helpful to engage, both early public testimony, mid-public testimony, sprinkling in sort of expanded testimony or remarks throughout our hearings. And, we certainly continue to find better ways to do it, because not all, it's not one size fits all. And I do appreciate Ruby's comments around the public only testimonies, which we started with budget a few years ago. Councilor Bach continued that this year. I think there was maybe 2 or 3 public testimony only hearings sprinkled out throughout the budget process, 3. And then ours earlier this fall. And it comes, to varying degrees. So it's certainly important for us individually and collectively to make sure that we're engaging the public and collecting information and questions, both to ask for ourselves, but also to send over to the administration, if it's the administration testifying, or to experts to offer testimony. I think the place where we continue to get jammed up is around engaging those that English is not their first language or their native language or the language they're most comfortable communicating in, both to deliver testimony or remarks and to receive. So that, I think, continues to be our challenge, and where I think a great deal of our focus needs to be, for sure. So I don't actually have any comments, because I think this has been a really questions. This has been a really sort of thoughtful, thought-provoking and engaging dialogue. I wonder if it may be helpful for us as a council and as a body of the whole, and something that we've been, in my office, for example, we've been on the docket has been the City Council, Youth Council idea. And one of the things that we were actually talking about as we're looking at the calendar and getting too close to the end of the year now is having a council of the whole. I'm going to preview it, Councilor Janey. Sorry, we haven't put this request in first, but I think this speaks to some of the challenges around open meeting law that we have, but having a council of the whole working session almost, not including panelists or administration, to discuss some of the issues, because before we move forward with that, it would be helpful to understand, without violating open meeting laws, where is the direction that we want to go, and perhaps using a model like that to discuss as a council of the whole what productive meetings look like, and sharing best practices without, again, violating open meeting law. So that's a tool at our disposal. Appreciate you, Lady, for example, being here at this hearing, which is unusual to have central staff participate in an official capacity in these conversations. And they certainly have the experience and the knowledge, both from the content, but also the logistics to facilitate these discussions going forward. So anyway, I've rattled on too long, but I think that this is really helpful in sort of generating some additional conversation. And as you can hear, the chaos is starting at the House. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you so much, Councilor Selby George. Councilor Arroyo, did you have any questions or comments for this panel?
Just quick comment. I didn't catch the whole hearing because I was coming in from something else. So I'm going to go rewatch it. It seems like it was very thorough. The one thing I will say is, as the chair of public health, we've had some long hearings due to COVID. We've had like a 5-hour one for the school reopenings. And we had a lot of anxious wanting to get in public comment and advocacy. And I think that the two things about this for me is figuring out ways to better engage that without being disruptive to the panels, because we also had doctors and folks on really tight timelines. So there's things there where it gets really tricky, where you're trying to manage panel availability plus access to the public. And so trying to figure out a good balance there. And I'm going to relook at this to see what suggestions are there, but also, beyond just the folks who are already there participating and making it easier or better for them to do that, making sure that we set these up in ways where people actually can attend them. And I think one of the small bright spots in COVID, if there was a bright spot about the way we've had to reshape this, is that I can't speak to what it was like to have hearings in chambers in terms of how many folks were watching and coming and doing that, because I had like a month of that. But I can speak to the online presence. I see President JD laughing to that, but it's true. I mean, we had like a month. All right. I think we had like 2 hearings. There was like a ZBA hearing and something else. And I didn't see like great amount of people there, but it wasn't nobody. But I do think that online has certainly opened up the availability and accessibility. And there's things like that where hopefully one day when we are back in chamber, we figure out how to mold the two, because I know that having it accessible in this way has opened up people to going to hearings that would have never gone to City Hall and sat down and try to figure out. So, you know, have it. I see people have it on at work. They have it on at different places in ways they just weren't going to do before. And so I think that there's been ways in which we really have to explore how we make this the good parts about what has come out of Zoom, which is the accessibility as well, but also how we can make that better as counselors and how we structure things and how we time them. But thank you so much to both the maker for this and for this really important topic, because I see the hearings as one of our things that are really important, because it's how we get information out to people. But if those people can't get that information or can't be accessible and can't be part of that process, then it sort of takes away all of that. And so this is very important, goes kind of structurally to me, to the fundamental purpose of our jobs. So thank you for all of the work. And I am going to rewatch all of what I missed.
Thank you so much, Councilor Arroyo. And for me, just a few questions of this panel, then we'll go. I think there's one person waiting for public testimony. We'll hear from that person, and then we'll go to the second panel. I want to echo the thanks, one, for this panelist and of my colleagues. Special shout out again to the makers for bringing this hearing order forward. I also want to shout out Councilor Mejia and Councilor Flynn. I think he may have stepped off, for their constant and continual advocacy around language access, which is a big piece of this. I know when I was just preparing for this hearing and looking at the hearing order language, and there was one of the whereases that said in 2019 that there were only 3 off-sites out of the, I think, 148 hearings, that only 3 were off-site. And I was curious, well, how many did we do in 2018, and what was the drop, and why was that? I know the last hearing that I did before today was in Dorchester, in Fields Corner, that I chaired. I think Frank Banker was the sponsor. It was about Little Saigon. It was a great hearing. We did it at night. We did it in the evening. We did it in his district. There were tons of people that were there who most likely would not have made their way to downtown, and certainly not during the day. The flip side to that is I've also been in the chamber during the day, like 10 a.m. on a midday, just ordinary day, and it's been packed. And again, it speaks to like the organizing that people have done to get it packed. And I think what we've got to do is figure out that balance of making our work more accessible in the district, in the evening, off hours, so it's not always downtown and during the day. One thing that I was really excited to do as president was hold some city council meetings, which are different than our hearings, actually out at night and in the district, because our meetings are always Wednesday, 12 o'clock, period. And actually, this was Councilor O'Malley who gave me this idea. We were going to have, and it's written in this year's rules, at least 9 city council meetings in the outside, out in the community somewhere, hosted by the district councilors at nighttime. We haven't been able to do it because of COVID, but I'm hopeful that hopefully we can do it next year. And if we can't, that the next president coming in 2022, hopefully will continue that tradition in their own rules, and we'll finally get that off the ground. In 2018, we did a lot better in terms of offsite. We had 7 instead of the 4. And the Madison Park with me and Councilor Sabri George and Councilor Wu. It was already mentioned, the one that we had at the House of Corrections from Councilor Campbell. We did the gentrification hearing that I did in the district. And then my maiden speech, I held that hearing also in the district. And when I noticed when I was probably more in the role that you're playing now, Ruby, as an organizer and advocate on the outside, I would come to council meetings all the time. I would sit over behind where you would sit, Arroyo. I would sit over on that side. And in fact, your brother would be there oftentimes. And I would have to ask, hey, we don't have the presentation. So the council all had the PowerPoint presentation, the public. So to me, part of accessibility is the information. Right now, it's still the case that just the councilors get that PowerPoint. We don't get that PowerPoint until we walk into the chamber. That I feel like is a big challenge. We publicly notice our meetings 48 hours in advance. Why aren't we getting 48 hours to also review what slide deck would be coming? That, you know, that hasn't happened. We get it when we walk in. And I appreciate that oftentimes the administration may still be working on that, but I think there's a lot of work that we can do to make this much more accessible to the public and just much more productive for us. Like, I'd love to see the slide decks long before I walk into the chamber. I did have some questions, and Julady, you may have some of the answers. I am interested in just getting on the record how the overall process, and I know you talked about it earlier in your opening or in response to another colleague's questions, but how much does it cost for us to do interpretation?
Yes, it depends on how many hours, how many interpreters we need. The least expensive interpreter that I have booked has been about $75 an hour. However, that also speaks to quality. So there are hearings where more than one interpreter has to be booked if it's a hearing that we know is going to be very long, or there are a larger group that needs interpretation. We usually, the recommendation is to have 2 interpreters instead of 1. Now that's double the cost.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. So I can't really say a specific number, you know, put a specific amount, because it all depends on the length of the hearing and how many languages and things like that.
Right. So I think what would be helpful at some point is us trying to quantify, because if we are trying to kind of build in a systematic way in terms of having resources in the budget to accommodate that, then we've got to kind of know. So I guess I would wonder, or I would ask ourselves as a body or you, me asking president, asking you staff director, for us to really try to get a per hour per person per interpreter. So if we have nothing else, we know $75 an hour at the low end, maybe 150 at the top end per hour per interpreter. Average hearing is X length. Average number of hearings per year are blah, 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 so that we can get some sort of ballpark figure for an annual cost. I see a hand. I'm going to ask Ruby Reyes to jump in. Did you want to add something?
I was just going to say that from what we understand for BPS interpreters, they make $40 per hour and $20 per hour for document translation. So you can kind of see the huge disparity there in what interpreters are normally paid or standard, right? The range versus what BPS budgets for interpreters. So I think that speaks to the quality piece, and quite honestly, you know, if there's an interpreter that can get paid a normal rate outside of that, why would they prioritize, you know, BPS as a translation opportunity?
Right. And then I wonder on, so one thing that was really exciting to me earlier this year, and I think it was, I don't know if this was Councilor Mejia and Councilor Flynn or what it was, but there was, I think it was you, Councilor Mejia, because you had a hearing order on language access, and we were having that hearing. And what I'm really interested in, and I think if we're doing like language access, is from the beginning to the end, from the information that we're sending out prior to the hearing, including like the public notice, to once we're having that hearing, and then how we share that hearing out and what language that hearing is available in after the fact. Like, I'd love to be able to take an entire hearing where I understand the vast majority of us are going to be speaking English. There might be some interpretation throughout, depending on if someone is testifying in the public, but I'd love to have that whole hearing at some point translated and offered online, just like we have the YouTube channel with all of our hearings, and we have all of those hearings are in the language that they're spoken to at the time. Wouldn't it be also great if we could offer those hearings completely translated to folks? If nothing else, subtitles at the bottom. Like, how do we expand from the very beginning, during, and then even after around? And that's just language access. Any ideas of who's doing it right that we could look to? Anyone? And if not, that's just homework for us all, because this is ongoing work about how we make our work more accessible. So don't feel like if you don't have who's doing it right, that means it's just all more work for us all to figure out. All right, so I don't want to take up too much time with too many questions here. I know there was at least one person wanting to testify. I want to get that person in so that they don't have to wait till the end. And then we'll go to the second panel. Certainly, as I always do, I invite the first panel, it's usually administration. I invite them to stay and continue to follow along. So if panelists, the three panelists here would like to stay, you're certainly welcome to kind of take it all in. I'm going to ask Carrie at this point to let in, I think it's Lisa Graff is waiting to testify. If we could let her into the room, please. Hello, Lisa, are you with us? Hey, how are you?
I'm doing
Welcome.
good.
Welcome.
This is my first time speaking at a city council meeting, so.
Oh my God, well, welcome. And you chose a great hearing to speak at then. This is a hearing about how we make sure we are much more accessible to the public. We usually ask people to state their name and perhaps their neighborhood or organizational affiliation, and then you can offer your testimony. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'm Lisa Jean Graff, and I live in the Fenway, and I'll start reading. A couple of years ago, I was responsible for taking notes at city council meetings for an internship at City Hall with a focus on the city budget. As I take in information best through reading, I requested PowerPoint files and city budget documents as resources. Although all of this information was useful, it didn't include the words spoken by city councilors about the budget. I could watch videos of city council meetings and read the closed captioning, but if I wanted to take notes, I had to freeze frames and write down what was said. It was a slow and tedious process. The transcripts from the closed captioning from these meetings were posted on the boston.gov website, but they were often delayed. The transcripts also had a good number of typos, but they were at least quicker to read and work with. Currently, these transcripts are no longer posted online. To read them, you have to request them. Moving forward, I have some recommendations. To start with, I request that the text from closed captioning be included on the boston.gov website. Ideally, the text would include timestamps so that accuracy of the text could easily be cross-checked with the videos of the meetings. I would also be interested to learn if the stenographer's record could be converted into readable text that could be posted on the boston.gov website. I would imagine that approach would have less typos. It would also make it easier to create translations into more languages. These requested changes would be beneficial to residents with hearing loss and audio processing challenges. These changes would also benefit activists and journalists, as it would be easier to get quotes from politicians at city meetings. This would help keep elected politicians accountable and help them do their jobs through having a more engaged public. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Lisa. And if you don't mind, I'd like to ask a follow-up question. I know you're not on the panel. Do you know about software that could be used to do what you're recommending? Is there a particular software that you would say we should look into?
No, but there's one person on Twitter that's like been posting about it for a while, so I could just ask him. I think he gave me the information at one point, and I'll follow up on that.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate that, Lisa.
Thank you.
At this time, thank you so much. At this time, we're going to invite the second panel in. Carrie? Are we good? Inviting folks in? Great. So I believe we have Emily Torres-Cullinane and Eric Gordon joining us. Eric Gordon, I believe, is from MIT, and Emily is from MAPC. And if you guys could do a brief introduction or your presentation. I understand that you don't have a slide deck, right? You don't need, okay, great. We will go ahead. Emily, I'm going to ask you to jump right in, and then we'll go to Eric.
All right, good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up. Great, thank you. So I actually do have a slide deck. Do I have capabilities to share my screen?
Carrie, do you have that?
All set now.
All set? Okay.
All right. So
excellent.
Can you see my screen? Give me a thumbs up.
We can.
Awesome, wonderful. All right, well, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation to the counselors leading today. My name is Emily Torres-Cullinane. I'm the co-director of strategic initiatives at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, which is your local regional planning agency. I work with 101 cities and towns, Boston plus 100. And so today I wanted to share a little bit about public meetings in 2020, mostly on the virtual engagement side and accessibility. So just kind of wanted to focus on that. But I just wanted to further introduce myself. I'm a Boston Dorchester resident, also first generation. My parents are Colombian, so shout out to the Latino community, Latinx community. And I work with an amazing crew. I have 5 community engagement specialists, and I've been working at MAPC for 10 years, really leading the charge in community engagement, public participation, and offering technical assistance to our 101 municipalities. So for the last 9 months, we've been really focused on how municipalities have been adjusting to public engagement during this time. So I have so much to say on this topic, and I don't want to repeat too much what everyone said, but I'm just going to focus my comments a little bit on just sharing what municipalities have been doing, or how virtual engagement has addressed some accessibility challenges that have existed always, although not perfect, but I can go through those. So again, I will try to keep my comments brief and answer any questions that you have. But what I wanted to bring up was how virtual engagement has responded to some of these challenges and barriers that you have all mentioned today. So I'll speak of 2 sort of stakeholders. One is people who are knowledgeable users of technology and have access to technology. So where time, location of public meetings, having to have, childcare, perhaps people with mobility challenges or transportation challenges have had challenges and barriers to engagement. Some of the virtual, Zoom has sort of opened up some opportunities. I will say, just to kind of focus on challenges and barriers for a moment, a lot of what I've heard, I don't want to repeat what I've heard already, but yes, interpretation and translation, definitely logistics and oversight has been a barrier. And then something that you all spoke to today, which is comfort. I think when you go to an in-person meeting, it is very intimidating, and especially if it's not something you've done before. So I would just say that over the past 8 months, we've seen an increase in participation. I have a lot of anecdotal information. I don't actually have a lot of data because it's not necessarily collected. There is a planner from the town of Walpole, Ashley Clark, who did a survey to the whole state on zoning board of appeal meetings or hearings. She's received about 102 responses. And in those responses, I can actually share the results of that survey with you, we have seen definitely an increase of participation, especially from people that didn't participate in public meetings before. Some other, benefits: people can attend at will, where before you would have to really plan your whole day, or a lot of logistics around attending a public meeting. You now have access to recordings and access to maybe transcriptions to what was said before. Now you can sort of attend from any location. I've seen a lot of people sort of attend from their kitchen while cooking, or attend from a workplace, perhaps on a lunch hour or on a break. People have been participating, yes, sort of during work hours, where before that was definitely a barrier. Not needing childcare by having the virtual option. I myself usually have my children right here with me. They're not here right now, but interpretation and translation has also been a little bit more streamlined. And so those are some other benefits. And then it's a little less intimidating, right? So I'm talking from my house right now, although there are hundreds of people that can see me, and then this is recorded, and so hundreds and hundreds of more people will see me. But in this moment, it's a little bit less intimidating. I do want to speak about people that do not have access to technology or do not have the knowledge to use technology in the moment. So where right now, I would say making it accessible for a little bit more people. However, we have seen obviously a decrease in people who have challenges with access and knowledge to the use. So some municipalities have had programs or efforts where they've collected devices. So people have donated devices. I think the public schools have definitely done this, where devices have been donated to those that need it. There have been an increase of trainings for more people on how to use the technology. So whether that is in person in a safe sort of distance or outdoor trainings, I have seen a lot of municipal staff and libraries, especially libraries, sort of meet the challenge of actually training folks to use the technology, so then they can feel more comfortable and then participate in public meetings. That has had an additional benefit. In this moment, there are so many people that feel so isolated, especially sort of the older population, that actually if the municipality provides trainings on how to use technology, it actually helps older populations connect with family and friends through things like Zoom and other social media channels. Nonprofit organizations, community members have been sharing information as well with their communities, with their neighbors. And then by offering more call-in options, that is another way municipalities have been meeting this challenge. Some additional considerations on how to improve virtual meetings. Some municipalities have figured out how on Zoom to kind of show even the participants, showing the box and then showing who's in line to speak. That kind of helps a little bit, because otherwise you're kind of just sitting there like, I don't know what's going on, who's going on next, other than what was verbally presented. I think this ability to record and transcribe is very important, so for distribution and reference in the future. Live streaming, voiceovers. So voiceovers is something that I was speaking to MAPA Translations, who does translations in the region, and they said the voiceovers have actually become very popular, because there is also, with captions, there is a literacy challenge here. So not everyone can actually speak, folks can read in the language that they speak. And so by having investment in voiceovers, that actually does assist with communication. I think we've also been pushed to have more graphics and images and ways to easier digest the information presented, and then accommodate for people with disabilities in our communications. For example, you have closed captioning today. I'm just going to leave you with two more closing comments. So these are more than temporary solutions until we can get back to normal community engagement. Digital engagement will continue to grow, and the public will expect higher quality digital engagement. So something that was said at the opening, I think that people are now used to having virtual engagement, and I think we're sort of, our municipalities are being challenged to sort of maybe keep this level of engagement and keep this for the future, and perhaps not actually go back to normal, but just build upon. What's next for public meetings? I do see a future in sort of hybrid meetings, or trying to figure out sort of an update to the structure of how we do our facilitation for our meetings. Much of, I think, Councilor Mejia, you were saying, you know, and Councilor Janey, putting, you know, public comment in front, or how do you split up meetings so that the decision making is happening in a certain way, etc. So I think I just want to stop sharing here and leave you with a couple last comments. I would say it's not perfect, but you know, I think having, I would, you know, recommend maybe figuring out how to continue to use digital virtual engagement. But good community engagement is not just about logistics, it's also about how welcome people feel. And we've actually, you've spoken to that earlier. I've had planners joke that they were starting to feel like planning public meetings was like party planning, with food and music and games. And so my question is like, well, why not, right? Why not have these wonderful moments where community can come together and share and feel trust and connection with their neighbors? And so I would say those are all sort of investments in building a stronger civic infrastructure and stronger community so people can come together. So I will leave it at that. And if you have any questions, I would love to try to answer.
Thank you so much, Emily. Before we get to Q&A with you, I want to acknowledge that we've been joined by my colleague, Councilor Wu, and I'm going to turn it over to Eric next, and then we'll dive in. Eric?
Thank you so much. I've prepared some remarks to share with you today, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. So my name is Eric Gordon. I'm a resident of Jamaica Plain and a BPS parent, first and foremost. I'm also a visiting professor of civic media at MIT and a professor at Emerson College, where I'm the director of the engagement lab there. My research and practice is focused on the design of new forms of municipal governance that effectively incorporate technology to achieve stated values of justice and equity. The pandemic has exposed inequities and injustices that have long been in place, but have been relatively easy for power brokers to ignore. As a result, cities around the country are pursuing major reforms of policing, education, and health systems to better align with a growing public awareness of their inequities. This is largely happening through sweeping policy changes and political declarations that are likely to have only limited impact. When the new rules get proposed, but the fundamental structure of the game remains unchanged, the underlying problems persist. So the problems we are facing right now in our cities are systemic. It's not just a matter of a bad policy or two, it's a matter of systems of governance that have and continue to exclude those people who are most impacted by decisions. Sherry Arnstein, as a planner in the 1960s, introduced the concept of the ladder of participation that many people are maybe familiar with, where consultation was on a low rung that she described as tokenism. 50 years later, this is still how we govern. Decision makers consult with the public in overly exclusive public hearings, and they often retreat to a black box where they make decisions. As a result, there exists deep distrust in government, especially among BIPOC communities. And even as the city engages in good faith efforts to care for all of its residents, distrust is compounded not only by the actions of government, but by the methods of governance used to justify them. You see, nothing will change until we fix how we govern. Such that those directly impacted by decisions are not just consulted on answering the question, but are invited into defining the questions. So that the city of Boston is having this hearing on hearings is a step in the right direction. I commend you for taking the time to question the rules, for asking how can we change the public hearing and interface between government and the public that has substandard user experience. They are held at inconvenient times. We've already talked about this, mostly in English. They're designed with a rigid and limited set of interactions. The public's options for input are only consultation and agitation. So what if things were different? What if we redesign the hearing to be at a convenient time with usable and accessible digital tools, with cutting edge language accessibility approaches, where interaction was invited prior to the formulation of questions, and where building trust in the process was a citywide strategic goal? What if we took stock of the benefits of having hearings online, and in our consideration of a return to physical presence, imagined hybrid hearings where one could participate physically or digitally, synchronously or asynchronously? So I recently published a book called Meaningful Inefficiencies, in which I argue that public sector organizations, instead of merely seeking the most efficient way to deliver goods and services, need to deliberately and conscientiously design inefficiencies into systems so that people can build trust and procedures through trusting each other. This includes transparency in the use of data, non-extractive relational modes of consultation, and an explicit commitment to investing more in those that need more. So let's think even beyond the meeting. People often talk about 311 as a form of participatory governance. Boston was the first city in the country to adopt the 311 app, and it remains an exemplary case study in what is sometimes called public sector co-production. But 311, while opening up avenues for input, is a one-way street. People can report the existence of known problems like potholes, trash, snow removal, et cetera. But what about defining problems? I can't tell you what matters to me or my community if it's not already built into the system. This is not a technology problem, though. The tech does precisely what it was designed to do. It's an imagination problem. I mean, unless we imagine governance to be different, we'll get more of the same. So one way I'm pursuing these transformative efforts in Boston is through building capacity of public sector co-design.
Mr. Gordon, Mr.
Yes.
Gordon, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I'm going to ask you just to slow down a little bit for our interpretation.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
I know I was on a time limit and I was
Sorry. No.
too fast.
Feel free. You're good.
Yeah.
Just
okay. So
all right.
I appreciate that. One way I'm pursuing these transformative efforts, I cannot believe I made a huge mistake there. Obviously, we've been talking about translation, and here I am rattling off at 1,000,000 miles an hour. One way I'm pursuing these transformative efforts in Boston is through building capacity of public sector co-design. So in collaboration with Councilors Campbell and Mejia, as well as a dozen other public sector and civil society actors, I'm teaching a class this semester at MIT called the Civic Media Co-Design Studio. And this class brings together MIT students with community activists, organizational leaders, and government officials to collaboratively design new governance models around service delivery in Boston. We're exploring ways for communities, artists, and government to imagine and facilitate the creation of public spaces. We're exploring ways for communities to have more direct interaction with the Elections Commission so that our systems of voting can be more equitable. And we're exploring ways for low-income renters to be in dialogue with the Boston Public Health Commission around emergency preparedness, among other things. This class and the resulting collaborative governance network represents what I hope is just the beginning of Boston's investment in rethinking governance. So I'll leave you with this. Extraordinary times call for extraordinary actions. As our national politics have eroded trust in systems of government, we need more than just new representatives and new policies. We need new processes that level the playing field to our system of government. We need to think expansively about how to incorporate new technologies to transform the interfaces between government and the public, such that they represent the values that we are eager to promote, namely justice and equity. So I thank you for starting this process, and I'm optimistic that with some political will and a whole lot of grit, we can make the changes that are necessary.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gordon. I'm gonna do a quick round of Q&A with my colleagues of this panel. And before Lisa gets off, Lisa spoke just before the second panel, offered some public testimony. I'm going to ask Julady to respond to the closed captioning before I direct questions to the second panel. Julady? After Julady, in order of appearance, I'm going to start with the lead sponsor, and then we're going to go directly to my colleagues. So go ahead, Julady.
I just wanted to say about the closed captioning. We started offering closed captions in 2013. The captions are live on video, and there is a text file that is created for each session. The captions are available for. Those files were being posted online on the web, as she said, Miss Lisa, I believe her name is, and there was no demand for it at the time. So it was a lot of manpower and work and time to put all those transcripts or records on the website, and they were getting no hits. So we decided to move forward by doing it on a per request basis. So anyone that will request those files, Carrie will immediately send it. Right now, he is working on catching up and putting all those files since for this year online. So, it can be just a little bit patient. That is in the works. The other thing that she mentioned about the transcripts is that in the city charter, the council cannot incur any charges for providing transcripts for council debates. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you so much, Julady. I am going to turn it over to my colleagues for questions of this second panel, beginning with our lead sponsor, Council Mejia. Council Mejia, you have the mic.
Yes, so I feel like I'm in my community engagement heaven, because the folks who have spoken are all about the work. And so it's always just great to be in company with people who are doing this work and do so with so much heart. So thank you both for all that you brought to this conversation. I am curious in regards to, this is for Aaron, you mentioned that there's been an increase in participation, especially among people who have never participated before. Can you talk about what groups are participating more and what groups we still need to activate? And then I'm also curious, can you talk a little bit more about what cities and towns have made an effort to train people to use technology so that they can access public services? Like who can you point us to in terms of some of the best practices? And can you also talk about some of the in-call options and how have they been received?
Okay, so I think there's a couple questions there. So in terms of who's been participating, so of course this is anecdotal, but I've heard that many more sort of parents have been able to both participate at the same time, where before it was, if it was a home of two parents or two caretakers, only one would be able to go. So at least like a whole household could attend a meeting. More sort of on the younger side, where it's youth or young professionals, or even sort of that 30-40 range, have been sort of participating more often. I would say there's been, I've been to some meetings where people have said, this is for my first time. I think we had someone today, even first time giving a comment. And so that is something that we've seen. All right, so that was a little bit about people who are participating, who are not coming. I would say, it's been very hard, again, for seniors, for folks that perhaps don't have access to technology. So perhaps, someone that doesn't have a device that they can use from a safe space. So that would be something to obviously work on. But I have seen diverse populations, especially if you were to look at, any hearing or any public meeting about the public schools across our region. I would say there's been such an increase of diversity, because it is the people that have, school-age children. So what was your second question, Counselor?
I think that my last question was, can you talk to us a little bit about some of the cities and towns
that have
made efforts to train people to use technology so they have access to public services?
Right. So Chelsea, I would say, is a wonderful sort of a peer of yours that also has a very diverse population. I would say there's actually a handful of towns. So I don't know if it makes it easier, but they have a smaller population. And so towns like Franklin or Foxborough, there's just been sort of staff that have, Stoughton, have sort of stood up and said, I can help. Dedham, I'm working with the town of Dedham right now, which is doing virtual town meetings. And we've held 5 public trainings so that town meeting members can participate in a virtual town meeting. Stoughton as well. So there's just a handful that I can send you as a resource. And then, was there another third question?
I think, no, I think the groups that are still not to be activated, do you know why? I think you mentioned a little bit, but can you just go into, aside from technology, are there other issues that you think are preventing people from being engaged?
Right. I mean, I think especially there's a huge public health crisis. So I think that is something else that people are dealing with. So people's personal sort of life challenges are heightened in this moment. And so those are some of the reasons maybe why people haven't been, I've seen a drop in actually a little bit in sort of in September and October in participation. And I think it was just because people also were dealing with trying to figure out how to have their children, you know, I'm speaking a lot about parents, but, you know, any caregivers had to figure out how to work and have children in the home so that has also been very challenging. And I think people are quote unquote zoomed out too. You know, being on this screen takes a lot of energy, a lot of mental power. And so you kind of have to sort of select what it is that you're going to actually engage in online, because I think people can only take so much.
Absolutely. I think we all have we're Zoom zombies. Thank you for that. I'm going to go really quick to Eric. It's great to see you. I just have two quick questions for you. If you could, I think your perspective about how we need to fix the structure of our policies need to come before fixing the policies themselves. But I'm curious, you know, how do you envision that happening? And then my other question is, I'm curious as to know what your role, how my role and my impact as a counselor will live on after my tenure, whatever that may be. And that's also an issue that has come up in your class. And how are you encouraging your students to give their ideas beyond the classroom? And what can we learn from this as it relates to policy and co-design? If you understand what we're trying to get at with that question, is that it can't just be about this current administration and the work that we're trying to do, but how do we lay down the foundation in a way that has a long-term sustainable model for that engagement?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Counselor. I think the first question was about how do we shift the way we do policy before the policy is sort of maybe a chicken and an egg. And maybe a chicken and egg question. I think the answer to that is that shifting the way that we do policy is I guess precisely what is happening today, right? This is directly addressing the question of how we govern and essentially how we kind of open up the structures of government beyond what we're used to. And I think what's so interesting is that we've already sort of been moving in that direction over the last 10 years or so. With the sort of interest in the use of technology and in different forms of government, and that all that got accelerated with the pandemic. And now here we are, we got thrust into this situation, and all of a sudden we're taking stock of it. We're failing and putting a bunch of things together. And the problem is we're not learning from it, right? I mean, we're trying, and as Emily is pointing out, she's doing this incredible sort of work on the metro level, but we haven't built the learning culture. I mean, even within this meeting, I've heard, people say, well, we tried this here, that seemed to work, but we're not creating a learning culture. We're not documenting. We're not even as a city, we're not figuring out what's working and what's not working. We're not growing. So, maybe it's an opportunity for the council to lead that effort to say, you know what, we're gonna try a few things, but we're not just gonna try a few things in a vacuum. We're going to try a few things, we're going to document those things, and we're going to learn from it. And to your other question about, what happens after this class is meant to be again, an experiment in building a learning culture around how we do these things better. And what I'm hoping from the class, first of all, I hope your tenure does not end at the end of the semester. And I'm hoping that this continues to be a long-term relationship and a sort of building out of a network of people both within government and outside who are invested in doing this kind of experimentation and learning from our successes and our failures, and then becoming better at this over time. And using the pandemic as a sort of leapfrog moment where we can actually be better at opening up government.
Yep. And then my last follow-up, and then I know I want to be super mindful of my other colleagues, but to this point, Eric, what I find as a point of tension is that there is this expectation that we're going to just do things and plow through them. And because there's a sense of urgency in terms of the things that need to change, right? So systems need to be built. We need to be able to figure out how we accommodate them. So a lot of the focus that we have poured into is like, how do we build that infrastructure for real meaningful engagement? but then how do we do it within the constraints that we find ourselves in with the bureaucracy of the bureaucracy, and the politics of the politics, right? So I think that there's a tension, and I really do appreciate the importance of learning, because what we do now has to set the stage for how we continue to do business in government. But there is a tension between the systems that we find ourselves operating under that have existed far before any of our time. And I think that is where I think the opportunity lies, and in bringing some folks like yourselves and Emily into these conversations to help us really think through how do we dismantle these systems that prevent us from really being engaged with those that we serve, if that makes any sense.
It does make sense. And I think that maybe an answer to that is that maybe this doesn't live in government. You know, government sort of opens up the space, sort of creates a table, and then and invites others to it, to overuse that metaphor. But I guess you know, Boston, there's a lot of universities in Boston, and there's a lot of people like, you know, like me, who are invested in some of these issues. There are these sort of kernels of the ability to create a learning culture that connects government and universities and NGOs and, you know, and others and activists together to actually build this thing. So maybe the answer to your question is that it doesn't live in government. It lives outside. I'm not saying it lives in a university, but it lives somewhere else, so that it's not completely beholden to the bureaucracy of government, but government can be at the table where we can actually scrutinize that bureaucracy and then figure out how to move forward.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Madam President, I relinquish whatever little time I had left.
Unmute. Okay, I was having problems with the mute button there. And I think it's just the two of us, so we can have at it. But I don't want to take up too much time. I'm mindful that this hearing did start at 1, and I don't want to hold folks hostage. I did have a few follow-up questions. I really appreciate this panel bringing forth their good thinking about this issue. I would add, I think there is this tension, and I want to add another layer to the tension, which is, I think there is, existing within the halls, there is this culture of, this is how things are done, this is how we've always done it. And I think within those same halls, we have, certainly on the council side, a lot of folks who are new. The vast majority people on this council are brand new. So 7 people are, but the majority of this council just got here. 4 this term, 3 the term before that. And so with this newness, and the vast majority of us coming in new are people of color. And so I think there is this tension around, here's how we've always done things, and this is how things are done. And then you've got new folks coming in who, that may not be our lens. This is how we've always, that's how you guys have always done it, but how we do it where I come from may look very different than that. So I think there's that tension as well. I think it's a good tension, because I think it's the tension that is forcing us to even have this conversation about how we do our work, and how we open up those doors. I wanted to ask anyone who is still with us on the panel. I know we have some folks from the first panel who are still here. I'm really interested in the childcare question. As an organizer, community organizer, I first started doing community organizing work in Boston at Parents United for Childcare and organizing around childcare. This nonprofit was formed by parents because parents recognize the gap. People are being, women, white women in particular, going back into the workforce, where many folks who look like me were always in the workforce. We have always had to work, but we're going back into the workforce, and then had the challenge of being working moms and not having reliable childcare. So that organization formed, and we believe, as just from the name, Parents United for Childcare, of course, if we're organizing and doing meetings around a particular bill or whatever, we've got to provide childcare. How, and we did the best that we could as being non-childcare providers. So I want to say that. I heard from the first panel childcare being offered at school committee meetings. I've advocated for that. I've been there. I've seen how that happens. I've heard people say we should do it here on the council side. A question beyond the budget, because we've got to figure out how we pay for these things. But beyond that issue, I have questions around liability. So I just wonder for organizations, whether it be a nonprofit, whether it be a government body, whether it be a private corporation, whomever, if you are getting into the business of offering childcare on a temporary basis, and God forbid something happen during that time, I just wonder how that works. And so if this council is being asked to now provide childcare, and I think on the principle of it, many councilors would agree and support that. I think the vast majority of this council are parents and have had to be working parents and understand, what it means. And we want to certainly accommodate the public who are oftentimes working parents. But I think, as president, I have to be mindful about liability issues, and I'm sure the next president coming in, the same thing. And so I'm interested in understanding how folks deal with that. If you've experienced that, Emily or Eric, or I see Stephanie may still be on the call, and Lady, you can feel free to jump in as well.
I can just add very quickly that as a state agency, we have provided childcare, and it has been through hiring professionals. And just like with interpretation and translation, but you need to have professionals, and you also have the liability. I think
so is that insurance that you have, liability insurance?
So we have, I think, hired people that do have insurance, and they have coverage.
Okay.
I will say some folks, nonprofit organizations that I've worked with, especially people that work with families that have children with special needs, gets very specific on what kind of childcare you provide. And so in some instances, you might think about just providing stipends so that person with children can figure out a different way to cover their own specific childcare. And so you sort of get into some details there, but just something to share.
Excellent. Does anyone else want to jump in on that one?
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so before the pandemic started, St. Stephen have almost 200 parents organizing, and the meeting always be on St. Stephen. We provide childcare. We have the teenager. We have St. Stephen have after school program. So the teenager who work on St. Stephen during the after school, they stay on the night. We had the meeting over 7 o'clock for the parent can join us. So they stay on the night. St. Stephen pay the extra hour to them for they can have, the childcare. And also we have, provide food for parents, like Dominican food for them. But always in the meeting, we have childcare. Any meeting we go, we provide the childcare for the parent can, understand the meeting, the kids around, stuff like that.
Wonderful. Eric, would you lady, any comments on this?
Yes, I have been doing some research and based on what cities are already providing these services. And I know that Ithaca, New It was the first city to officially offer childcare at its council meetings. And my understanding of it is that they do it by having the trained teens from community centers run by the city provide the childcare, and they are under city insurance policy. I don't know how much that costs, but I know that's through my research, that's how they do it. Also, Pittsburgh launched a pilot program, and the way that they did is that they hired pop-up childcare providers. And those are trained professionals that come with their own insurance policies to cover any liabilities, because we have to think about liabilities when we're doing this, especially if we're going to be in city premises.
Right. Follow-up questions for anyone on this, specifically to you, Julady, with these models that you've identified in Pittsburgh and Ithaca. If you know the answers to this, and if not, I hope that we can get them after the fact. Do you know right now if it's by request or if it's a standard, there's always a childcare room open and ready to receive, 1 or 2 kids or 1 or 200 kids? Like, how does it work?
It was standard for Ithaca, and for Pittsburgh, it was by registration,
Okay.
online registration.
Which seems to make sense anyway. You would need to know the ages. You'd need to have
Ages,
some sort of record of them, or
How
with the
many do you
request,
need?
any
Yeah.
allergies, exactly. Does anyone have other examples other than Pittsburgh or Ithaca around who's doing childcare and/or language? And I add childcare because of the liability, and I'm really trying to understand the liability. But if there are other good examples that are not childcare related, that are just around language or evening or just all of the accessibility points that we're talking about, I'd be interested.
I have a comment that is not a direct response to that question, but another way to think about childcare is that if there are actually viable opportunities for people to continue to participate remotely, then it addresses some of those concerns, right? So I'm not suggesting that childcare is not offered. It needs to be for those who are going to be there in person. But if we actually do the work in creating a hybrid model where the remote participants are on an equal footing as the people who are in person, then that solves some of those issues. And so that
I want to
also
follow
requires
up on that,
investment.
Eric. I want to follow up on that. So I would agree with you. And I think, and in my mind, certainly while I'm president, I can't speak to who's coming after me, but while I'm president, I think it is important to take what worked well from the virtual world and incorporate it as part of our long-term. We've figured out this is how we can bring folks in. You don't have to physically be present. You could be in California if you want, but come in. So I definitely want to make sure that we're doing that. But you talked about equal footing, and that's what I want to kind of get on. Equal footing between those who are in the room and those who aren't. I mean, I've never experienced a situation where there's equal footing when some people are physically there and some people aren't. I don't know how. I mean, maybe this Zoom hearing might be it, but we're all on the Zoom. So I've been like, I'm sure we've all been in a meeting pre-COVID where somebody couldn't make it and they say, oh, just punch me and put me on speakerphone, right? They are always at a disadvantage. The person on the phone is always at a disadvantage compared to the people who are in the room. I'm curious, when we do kind of find ourselves in what I think is going to be our future, which is going to be this hybrid of in-person and people who are going to participate remotely through, testimony or whatever, maybe it's a panel. How would you suggest that we level that playing field? Because in my experience, it is always unequal and uneven.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that, and sometimes it's the person who, the remote people actually are given more attention, and then the people who are sitting around the room are like, oh, we're putting all this attention to this remote person. So yes, I agree. It doesn't work. But we haven't spent any time actually thinking about the design of what good hybrid spaces are. And so what I'm suggesting is that we actually devote energy to figuring this out. Just as we're figuring out what a good meeting is, whether it's online or offline, we need to figure out what a good meeting is that's hybrid and devote the proper attention to it.
Yep. I see my sister wants to jump in on my time, so I'm going to let her get in here. Go ahead, Councilor Mejia. Go ahead. It's good. You're the lead sponsor. Come on in. And we're the only 2 left in here.
No, so this is always, I'm always trying to figure out the rules of engagement of how these public hearings even work. Like, I'm always trying to figure out, could I come back in at some point because you're talking about something that I want to chime in on? Do I have to wait until my closing remarks just to say a few words? So I want to be respectful of the process, but I do want to get into this conversation that you just started.
Go ahead, jump in. You're good. Go ahead.
Okay. So in terms of the, for 2 things, one is around the childcare, and I'm so glad that you brought it into the space, President Councilor Janey, is because I talked about this on my campaign trail, is that I'm going to offer childcare and food at all of the hearings. And I didn't even think of the legalities of it. And I didn't think about the budget. I just felt like, listen, if we're serious about engagement, we're going to have to remove all barriers. But that conversation about the budget is what we value. And we need to put financial resources aside to be able to pay for that childcare to be able to happen. And I also think that we need to figure out, how do we engage in, from a workforce development perspective, how do we partner up with our nonprofit organizations that are already providing childcare, and that there's ways that we can do it that is not going to have a big financial hardship, but that it's a win-win. So I'm really curious about figuring out that. And then in regards to the design, Eric, I really do believe it's really about the intentionality, right? That it may be difficult for us to live within this hybrid model, but we have to be intentional about how we design that space to ensure that everybody feels the same level of love and the same level of importance. And I think it's in the design phase of how we facilitate the hearings in terms of who speaks and making sure that we're in present, and then we go to the remote so that everyone feels. That's the best way I think we can level the playing field. But we have to be intentional about what that looks like. And then this is the last thing that I'll say, it's about that learning community. If we're not thinking about what we're learning in these spaces, and then how do we apply those lessons learned, then we're missing out this opportunity of creating hybrid models now and testing them out so that we can build that infrastructure on a long-term sustainability plan. And I'm sorry, President Council Janey, for cutting into your time, but this was such a
fine.
great,
I'm teasing
robust.
you. And I will say this, because there is another tension or balancing act. What I hear us all struggling with in this hearing is, what opportunities are available to us? What can we be intentional about and systematizing this in our rules? So the president is in charge of doing the rules, which kind of governs how and when we meet, right? And so in this year's rules, we have our regular meetings, which are those Wednesdays at 12. I've added, we haven't been able to do because of COVID, but I added, we need to take our council meetings away from just Wednesdays at 12 and put them at night, some of them at night, and in the community. And so we were gonna allow the 9 district councilors to each have a turn at hosting a city council meeting in their home neighborhood and go from there. We haven't been able to do that. With hearings, there's a lot more leeway to do whatever it is that you want. And it comes at the discretion of the chair. So as you know, on the one hand, we're thinking about what we can systematize and put into a codified document like our rules around thou shalt provide childcare or language or whatever it is, versus the discretion of a chair. So chairs have a lot of discretion to hold the meeting, you know, when they see fit. Obviously, in my mind, working with the sponsors who are bringing forth that hearing order. And I think it's important to have some level of discretion or autonomy as a chair of a committee to determine how you want to do it. When you leave all of the discretion to the chair, then that just means you've got to hope and pray that you've got good people chairing committees who get the importance of making sure we're doing evening meetings and offering language and doing our own due diligence in terms of organizing who, you know, how we get the word out and get folks to show up. So what I guess I am putting my finger on and highlighting is a potential tension or a need to balance. How much of this do we need to kind of systematize and say, as a chair, thou shalt do X, Y, and Z, versus a chair has a lot of discretion to determine when and where, presumably working with the sponsors, they are holding hearings. Yes, Emily.
So I just wanted to add here, because this is sort of where the conversation might be leading to, is that it's about the city of Boston and your rules, but also statewide could also be an update to open meeting law. I think you could actually pull back, and Eric, I think you were getting to that point, which is you could really pull back and take a look at just statewide, what are our, governing policies on public meetings? And I think even meetings, right? This is the way we've always done things. Can that be, can we be a little bit more creative about how we're collecting information, sharing information, having discussion or discourse, and making decisions? So, so one pitch I would like to make is at MAPC, we're currently updating our long-range regional plan. It's called Metro Common. And within it, we are actually looking at the next 10, 20, 30 years, and we're actually looking at what kind of actions can we take to make our government more dynamic. So I would invite, I hope this is really the beginnings of a conversation, and I would invite all the counselors, to participate, and I will share information after this, as well as the public. But I think there's definitely something to be said about, can we, in this moment, like Eric said, use this as an opportunity for creativity, and what is actually a process that could really use an update.
Thank you for that. And I think that is a good note to wind down and wrap up on. I will offer the lead sponsor an opportunity to offer a quick closing statement. And then I do hope that we will continue this work. I think it is very important. And I think there are a number of opportunities, whether at the state or the city, or just getting narrowed into the council. Like there's the council, there's the city of Boston, there's the state, there's all of these things. So I'm going to turn it over now to Councilor Mejia, who will offer a brief closing. I want to just say many thanks to both panels, and many thanks to Lisa, who is still with us, who offered testimony, and certainly all of my colleagues. Thank you guys for your very thoughtful presentations and engagement. Councilor Mejia, you have the floor.
Yeah. Thank you. So thank you so much. I'm so glad that it was you, Madam President, that was chairing this, because you have the power to really move the work forward in your presidency, right? Like taking this conversation and really applying and trying out some things next year. So, and that you're so invested in it, it's really, it couldn't have been a better person to chair this and to lead the work. So I'm really grateful that you're here and all in it. So thank you for hosting, and thank you to the panelists for bringing all of your, not just your creativity, but being really honest in terms of where our blind spots are and how we can, as a council, do better in serving those that we represent. And so, for me, I've always been about community engagement and civic engagement. Since I was a little kid, I know what it feels like not to be heard. And President Council always, Janie makes a joke about, okay, make sure you don't forget about Julia, because I always got to call people out if you don't call on me. And so I think it's with that same level of energy and commitment that we have to continue this conversation and work in collaboration with folks who have managed to figure some things out, to continue to hold us accountable and work with us to build. I'm really looking forward to creating a public process in terms of how we design and redesign how we hold our hearings. And I just want to move beyond just public hearings. I really want this this whole concept to be across all city government decision-making processes, right? It can't just live within the city council. I need to see this in the BPDA. I need to see this in the Boston Public Schools. All areas where decisions are being made about our lives, we need to be able to build the infrastructure to thoroughly be heard. And so I'm looking forward to all of it. So thank you all.
Thank you, guys. Thank you once again. I am going to adjourn this hearing, but I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you so much. This hearing's adjourned. On docket number, let me get the number right, docket number 0425, this hearing's adjourned.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you,
guys. Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye.
Lady, you did an amazing job.
Thank you. Nervous.